Thank you, Andrei and Irina, for joining us here today. At Google, we talk a lot about the user. I spent 2.5 years in Mountain View as a PM on a couple different products. And whenever I talked about the user, I would look at a dashboard. And that dashboard would have various numbers and graphs of the number of users in different countries, the level of engagement that they had on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis. And that was my touch point. But I think why I'm so grateful that you're joining us here today is that you represent the user in a so much more tangible sense. You are journalists on the front lines of a super important issue for Google. Our mission is to organize the world's information, make it accessible and useful, and that is what you do every day. You organize information on very sensitive, very challenging topics, and you make it accessible and useful to the world. And so my hope today is that we can get into what that process looks like, how technology has helped and hindered, and what the folks in this room who care about these issues can do to contribute going forward. To begin with, maybe if you're comfortable just sharing a little bit about your backgrounds, the work you do, and the places that you do it in.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, everybody, for having us. As Daria said and Justin said, we are the Russian investigative journalist, and we've been doing this for almost 17 years with a focus on the Russian secret services. In the late 2000s, we start off investigating the changing digital landscape in the country, and in 2012, it became quite apparent that the Kremlin got scared of the internet, and mostly because of the Arab Spring and the Moscow protest in 2011, 2012. So the Kremlin started a massive offensive on internet freedoms in our country.
Firstly, thank you for inviting me here. And as Andrei mentioned it, at this time, when internet censorship was introduced in Russia, became a start for writing our new book, The Red Web, The Kremlin's War on the Internet, which was published in 2015 here in the United States. But since 2015, there have been many developments in Russia and US relationship, and notably during the US election. And we felt that it was very important to write about this and to share what we found by adding a new chapter to the book. And we called it The Red Web Comes to the United States. And it was published this August.
So let's talk about how censorship works in Russia. Can you give me a little bit of a sense of, on a day-to-day basis, what the experience of someone in Russia is like as relates to censorship?
Well, on the surface, it looks like we have all elements, technological elements of censorship. We have internet filtering system with lots of blacklists, not one, of banned websites. We have an extensive system of online surveillance, and it's extremely intrusive. Actually, it's a system of backdoors to all services in our country provided for the Russian secret services. And we also have, unfortunately, we have people sent to jail for posting something sensitive or critical of the Kremlin. But at the same time, it's quite clear that this system technologically is not very, I would say, effective. Internet filtering is porous. For example, if you want to, believe that you need to access a blocked website, you can use very simple methods, simple tools. You don't need even to use VPN. You can use Google Translate. It also helps.
Anyone from Google Translate here today?
Well, say hello. And if you want to communicate securely, you still have this option. You can use messengers. Lots of them are extremely popular in Russia. And they were turned in a sort of new media. But still, the system is quite effective in silencing people who want to talk about things online openly. And I think the idea of the Kremlin approach is to be based more on intimidation than technology. And actually, it's a very Soviet approach. When we researched for our book, we checked how things were organized back in the Soviet times. And one of the most astonishing things we found out is that the KGB, the powerful security service, technically was not very advanced. At the height of powers of the KGB, it was capable of eavesdropping only on 300 phone calls simultaneously.
300 phone calls at the same time. That was it. That was the cap.
Yeah, that was 1991.
And everybody was frightened by the KGB in the Soviet times.
So actually, they knew how to send a message, but everybody should be very, very cautious. And it looks like they use the same approach today. They send a message. They can pick up some people, send them to jail, and that would make a trick.
And does that work when they send folks to jail? You know, whether it's an activist, a journalist, someone else. What happens?
What happens? Bloggers and users. That's not about journalists. Journalists haven't been sent in jail in Russia. When people found out that they're in jail, there are some kind of protest in their cities, or mostly in Moscow, and that's all.
Are those protests effective?
No.
One time it was effective when a blogger one blogger who went to the church and played Pokemon Go, and then posted video on YouTube, was sent to jail for posting this video, because it is very offensive for the Orthodox Church in Russia, and there is a special article at the criminal court. He was sent to jail. It incited a lot of protest on the internet, on YouTube, everywhere, and even on the street. And after this protest, he was
released.
He was bailed, and he wasn't released, but he's under house arrest now.
House arrest.
That's okay for him.
So what are people's views on censorship in Russia? Do people generally think that this is a good system, or they think it's a bad system, or they're just indifferent, they accept it as a way of life?
At the beginning, in 2012, when the authorities introduced this internet filtering system in the country, general public was not very interested in this, and we didn't notice any attention to these issues. We tried to attract a lot of attention, but we failed. But after then, a few years ago, the Kremlin made two big mistakes. The Kremlin blocked the most popular torrent website in the country, and then they tried to block Pornhub. After that, even people who have never been interested in Russian politics or in politics at all started learning how to use circumvention tools.
And actually, Russia, in a week after this biggest Russian torrents website was blocked.
You mean BitTorrent, the illegal file sharing service?
Yeah. Okay. So almost immediately, in a week, Russia skyrocketed to the second position in the number of Tor users. Now we are second only to the United States.
Tor, the anonymous routing browser?
Yes, this famous VPN, which is provided for free.
Got it. So as long as they don't go after your illegal file sharing or your pornography, it's all good. But once they cross those lines, people got agitated.
Absolutely.
Has there been any, on the political side, any mobilization or any cases where anyone has engaged in the same way?
Yeah, I think so, because initially the idea of internet filtering was sold to the public under pretext of protecting children against pedophiles and against people who spreading suicidal notes, something really strange. But people accepted this because it's all about children. But 5 years passed, and now everybody understood it's not about children, it's about politics. And this year we got street protests actually in Moscow. We got marches, we got big events, and the Russian Pirate Party organized some of these events, and we got thousands of people protesting.
So you said the Russian Pirate Party?
Yes, it's a very popular thing in terms of they monitor a lot of things about internet censorship, and also they try to organize some things offline. And the latest protest was really huge. It was about thousands of people.
That's very cool. Isn't the Pirate Party running Iceland, incidentally?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
It's a big inspiration for all branches of the Pirate Party everywhere.
Huh. Very cool. So turning to technology a little bit, is there anything you can share? You mentioned earlier that there's this technological censorship regime in Russia, but it sounds like it's only effective to a point. Why is that?
Well, I think that the problem is that when you have the internet in a country built for almost 20 years without any kind of intrusion from the government. And that was the case for Russia for almost 20 years, from 1991 to 2011. It's extremely difficult technologically to add this element of censorship and filtering. You need to redesign or redefine the entire infrastructure of the internet. It's extremely difficult, as the Russian authorities found out. Last year, they even tried to enlist some support from the Chinese. And the Chinese went to Moscow saying, like, we're happy to help, but you need to get rid of all American equipment. The problem is that it's really difficult. You cannot replace, say, in one day, all Cisco in such a big country with something produced in China. So that's why now we're trying to find a way how to remodel the critical infrastructure of the internet in Russia, but it's very tricky, and I don't see any successes so far.
In fact, the Russian authorities were frightened to replace the American equipment by the Chinese equipment. Chinese offered to put into the system Huawei equipment, and that's what frightened for the Russian security services, because they are very suspicious to Chinese.
Of Chinese, yeah.
So it also advantage for us.
Well, I don't think you need to convince a room of Googlers that doing a whole-scale infrastructure swap out is going to be technologically hard. How about on the sort of consumer side? You guys are individual actors. You don't have the resources of a large player. How do you use technology in your work? Is it a force for good? Is it a hindrance? What are your thoughts on that?
Without technology, we just wouldn't be who we are, because we set up our website, agentura.ru, back in 2000. And we were young journalists. We didn't have any money to pay for printing house, for paper, but we spent a little money for maintaining our websites, and it still cost us very cheap. So we can continue doing our work.
And also, it's extremely important for us, because for many reasons, now it's become really difficult to find a place for publishing your stories in the country. It's not a coincidence that we have both of our books, and the first was published in 2010. It was all about the Russian Secret Services, and the second one, Red Web, and both of them were published at first in the United States. But to communicate with our publisher, of course, you need technology. And thanks to Skype and Google Hangout, you might be in Moscow still communicating with your editors and publishers, which is a great thing. And also, of course, it helps us to gather information and intelligence in a way, because we can use all kinds of things like data mining, and now it's extremely important in Russia. You can use all these databases, and you can find some really exposing stuff. Like some years ago, thanks to one database, we found out that now we have in Russia not one system of online surveillance managed by one security service, but 8 of them.
Eight different systems of online surveillance.
Yes, built simultaneously by 8 agencies. And we just found out that thanks to data mining, because officially you cannot get any comments from these agencies, because it's considered to be state secret. And sometimes technologies which were not meant to be used by journalists proved to be extremely helpful. For example, drones. And some years ago, I think it was 7 years ago, Irina had a very big investigation about the luxury villas which were given for free to the FSB, Russian Security Services generals. And I think that time you never thought that you can actually approach this.
It was impossible to approach. I got information. I checked all documents. It was clear that these generals just grabbed state real estate for free. But I had now a chance to approach to this real estate and take a picture because it was very well guarded by the security services and it was hidden under the huge fence. No chances. But now I can do this easily to launch a drone.
Actually, we got some interesting things available on YouTube. It's mostly done by Russian opposition leader Navalny's team, and they got this team and they can actually launch drones all the time. And the most recent example, they just I think it was 3 weeks ago, they exposed a new secret luxury villa renovated specifically for Putin's personal use. And it's crazy footage. You can see everything, and well, it's amazing.
And it's on YouTube, you say?
Exactly.
It's on YouTube.
So you mentioned that there are 8 different agencies. Can you give a little bit more color on the kind of things that they're looking at? I mean, you said earlier that they're filtering, internet stuff, but with 8 different agencies, is that all they're doing, or are there other activities?
Now, of course, we have other activities to do, but we have the right to conduct these kind of operations. So, because now we have this climate in Russia that actually, if you ask for some funds for the secret services, well, it's fine. Vladimir Putin is very happy to provide these funds. So these agencies just use it, this opportunity to build their own systems of online surveillance. The tricky thing about this surveillance, which is it's not like mass surveillance because there are still some technical problems for the Russian secret services, especially, for example, they do not know how to build huge databases. They still rely on American technologies like Oracle. To be honest, even the internal database of the FSB is built on Oracle.
Wow.
So they do not know how to do these things. So instead of mass surveillance, they do targeted surveillance, which means that they need first to know who should be spied on, and then they start the thing. But in a way, it's extremely effective in making the IT industry in Russia complicit in these activities. Because what actually it means that if you are small or big internet service provider in Moscow or in any town, you need to get a license. And one of the things in this license is you are required to install a special equipment, so-called black box which actually a backdoor. For that, you need to get a plan of implementation from the local branch of the FSB. And actually, it means that you need to get along with these guys, and you're provided a contact number. So a guy from the local branch could always call you and ask for some favors. And also you have physically a cable which connects your servers with the local branch of the FSB, and you know nothing about what actually is intercepted on your services because it's all state secret, and you have no security clearance. As ISP, you have no access sometimes even to the room where you have this black box. So it's a back door, but also it's a phone number. So you might be one day asked to shut down some website, or maybe to look into someone's emails accounts and to provide it to the FSB as a favor.
How do they decide who to target?
That's complicated. In fact, they have to combat crimes. But aside crimes, they monitor environment in particular region or in Moscow, say, and just to choose the victim. Usually, mostly, this is a person who was known for his or her political activity or some opposition activity or publishing something critical of the Kremlin. And when they designated this target, they started to monitor all his activity on the internet, and this is enough for. Sometimes it's enough for sending him or her to prison. Let me give one example. One guy was sent to prison for 2 years only for posting on his page on social network Vkontakte, which is modeled after Facebook, the most popular in Russia, pictures of toothpaste, of a tube of toothpaste, and something was like this: squeeze Russia out of yourself. He got 2 years in prison.
Sorry, I don't understand. It was a toothpaste that said squeeze Russia out of yourself?
Out of you, yeah.
Toothpaste and squeeze Russia out of yourself. That's Russophobic.
What is it even saying, though? What does that mean?
Well, nobody actually understands.
There is an allusion that there is an allusion to some saying of Russian writer Chekhov that means you need to
Squeeze a slave out of
squeeze
here.
the slavery from yourself.
Okay.
But at the same time, it's really stupid. It doesn't.
It was a meme. A meme got him 2 years in prison.
Yes.
Wow. Have you had near brushes with those kind of experiences?
Well, as I said, we started many years ago. I think it was 2000, 1999, 2000. And of course, back then, actually it started very early for us. Already in 2002, we got the very first criminal investigation against us. And sometimes it's really, I would say, well, you feel really nervous because these interrogations, they are conducted in a prison, actually, and just by chance. So you never know what might happen to you next, and maybe you would stay there, or maybe not. It's a big question. But I would say that if you try to understand how things changed, I would say that today the tactics became much more subtle. So back then it was mostly about targeting individual journalists. And now it's about how to deal with editors and owners of the media, and which results in a situation when you cannot find a place to get your stuff published. And you cannot say that, look, in a way it's worse, because when you have a journalist targeted by the Kremlin, it means that at least this journalist could apply to public. He might make his case public and say, look, I'm a victim of this kind of pressure. But now it's all a kind of management problem. It's between you and your editor.
Right, it's that same philosophy where there's the cable, but there's also the phone number.
Right.
And it's all kind of done.
Very manual.
Yeah, very manual. That's a good way to think about it. And you mentioned earlier that your book was published in the U.S.
Yep.
It was published here before Russia? Is that correct?
Yeah.
Why is that?
Because Russian publishers, they were not very understood the risks, and because it's a long story for us, so we started publishing this stuff in the West maybe in 2010, 2009. So we had kind of experience, and it's really interesting that Russian publications, sometimes they pick up your stories, but only after they publish it by the Western publications, and they always ask to maintain this byline that first time this was published in English in, say, The Guardian.
Okay, so
it helps them to shift responsibility and to say, look, it was already published somewhere. And the same goes with the books. So they say, well, one day we are happy to publish your book, but first get them published in the West. And actually that was happened. We got our book finally published in Russia, but only after it was published in the United States.
So sort of a boomerang outside-in strategy.
Yes.
And I'm actually surprised to hear that you were able to publish your book in Russia at all. Why is that?
Maybe because the first book became a bestseller. Actually, it made a lot of money for the publisher.
Congratulations.
And not for us.
Condolences.
But it was a really strange moment in the Russian history, because it was September of 2011, and the book was just published, and the FSB was not very happy, so they sent some letters. Actually, they sent some people for some strange reasons, they decided to visit the printing house. Why? Yeah, I still don't know.
So security services showed up at the printing house.
Not in the offices of the publisher, but in the printing house, and asking crazy questions like who paid for the printing of the book, and everybody said, okay, it's publisher. But and we were really nervous. But then we got these Moscow protests. So the FSB very soon they had some other things to do. They needed to deal with this political crisis.
And did they ever come back to the printing house?
No, they forgot about it completely.
Whatever works. I guess it's all people, and that's one of the themes, I think, of the points you've been making, that there is a technology element, but it really is as much manual as it is automatic.
Absolutely, yeah.
So looking forward a little bit, and we're going to pause in a few minutes, so if folks have questions as we go, just be jotting them down, and we'll open it up for any audience questions momentarily. But before we do that, I just want to turn to the future a little bit. Where do you see things going?
Yeah, you know, we are journalists and we hate to predict future and always fail. But even one thing is absolutely predictable, that Vladimir Putin will be the new Russian president next year.
Next year, yeah.
Right.
But, well, I think that if you try to see the whole thing, maybe we still have some source for hope, because it looks like with the internet, the Kremlin faces a formidable challenge, because it's historically, the whole Russian history actually has been defined by hierarchical order. We always had someone on the very top, well, calling shots. It was maybe the Tsar, or maybe the Emperor, or maybe the leader of the Communist Party. But right now, we are dealing with a situation when we have the network, which is by definition is a horizontal creature. And it looks like the Kremlin has some problems understanding with the nature of the network. Just 3 years ago, we had this excellent example. There was a case against this guy Navalny, and he was about to be sent to jail. And some of his people, they wanted to mobilize people to protest. So we launched a protest group on Facebook, and this group was immediately taken down by Facebook under request of the Russian government. And immediately we got lots of people outraged by this story, launching their own pages. Asking people to get to a particular place in Moscow. And as a result, we got tens of thousands of people protesting on the Moscow streets.
Tens of thousands of people,
yeah,
spontaneously.
Spontaneously, just like that. So I think these things is still very difficult for the Kremlin to understand. And it gives us some hope.
Yeah, Putin still believes that the internet is ruled by some guys on the top, and he said that it is the CIA.
Yeah, actually.
Really?
Yeah, he actually.
He said that the CIA, that the internet was a CIA creation.
And in general, how do they think about technology? So that's one, data point. How do you think, 5 years from now they'll be sort of conceptualizing the internet?
Well, in our business and for the media, it would be all about social media, and we already have some interesting things that people try to abandon the idea of domain names for the media. They move to social media. So we have some recent investigative project, which was launched solely on social media. We have a page on Facebook, a page on Contact, and something on medium.com. That's all. And it's not only because we believe in the idea of social media, but also because it's more secure. Because once you have a website and a domain name, it might be easily blocked. You might get some visitors. And if you have everything based on social media, that provides you with some opportunity. And simultaneously, some people who still believe in the idea of domain names, they think that now maybe it's time to move to Google, because it's also a big issue for the countries with authoritarian regimes. One thing is to block a website of a particular media. It's easier, especially if it's Russian registered or it's. But if it's it's actually physically on Google, it means if you want to block it, you need to deal with the whole Google. And it's such a sensitive thing for many that even in the countries of Central Asia, and usually they're not that subtle, they're still hesitant. And they do not know what to do with this new phenomenon, that many media might be physically based on Google services. They just don't know how to deal with this problem. So maybe that provides us, again, some sense of, maybe some source of hope.
Do you foresee any changes to the policies or the laws or the enforcements around that?
Well, the problem is that we have this problem, the idea of localization. The idea that I hate this term, but the balkanization of the internet. Unfortunately, it's such a great idea for many, especially in Russia and China. They love the idea. They brand it as a digital sovereignty. And sovereignty.
Sovereignty. Digital sovereignty.
And it's about borders. Like we have our territory, and it's limited by borders. We need to have exactly the same thing on the internet. And the idea is that if you have some service, it might be Facebook, Twitter, anything, Google, you need to have all servers with the Russian, with this particular country, citizens' data on this territory, just to be able to access it easily and to manipulate maybe with this data. And unfortunately, it's a very I would say, appealing idea to many because it's something about patriotism. Like, yes, for example, we were at some meeting with the Russian officials, and they said very openly, yes, we are very grateful to the Americans. They invented the whole thing, but now it's time for us to control our space. It's about our sense of the national state.
And the great opportunity for the security services to get direct access to users' data, because now they're not able to spy on the services located abroad, because they can't find the direct access to it.
So last question before we turn to the audience. Overall, are you an optimist, a pessimist? Do you think that the internet will be a force for good 5, 10 years from now, or do you think we're sort of in this unique window in history that's going to close?
Well, you know that when we started writing our book, our publisher, American publisher, said, look, you need to add something optimistic in the end of your book, because otherwise, why to read it? And finally, we thought, wow, maybe there is something in this idea. But seriously, no, we are optimists. We believe that right now, we have these opportunities. We can publish very sensitive stories, and it's only thanks to technology. And it looks like for the Kremlin, they might know some tricks, but it's really difficult for them to catch up with the development of technologies. And also the problem is, which also gives me some hope, just this year, Vladimir Putin signed a new information security doctrine. And it's essentially Soviet. It actually has one thing, that before introducing some new technologies, telecommunication companies should first consult with the secret services. And we knew that actually back in the Soviet times, that destroyed the telecommunication market in our country. Because if you need first to ask someone who is wise enough to think about security, well, it just slows down everything. And that gives us hope.
How does that give you hope? That seems like a
Well, it's worrying in terms of that it would slow down the, say, internet business in our country. But in terms of giving the forces of control some new means, I think no, they always, I would say. No, for them it's just difficult to catch up. They're always a bit slow.
I see. It's evidence that the mindset has not been evolving.
Yeah.
Got it.
When you need to choose what's the most important thing, the development of technologies or security, and you always choose security, it means that you lose something very important. We live in a world when development of technology is an essential thing. And if you always trade it for security or for the ghost of security, you lose.
Got it. Right. You can't. It's not going to be viable to keep up with the international technology scene if that's the approach.
Yeah.
What do you think, Irina?
I think that Kremlin is always losing to the technologies because the Kremlin doesn't understand the nature of the internet, and that is very advantageous for us. Very good, big advantages for us.
Got it. Well, thank you so much for the work that you do, for sharing it with us today, for taking the time to answer these questions. And I'll turn it over now, but let's do a round of applause.
Thank you.
Hi. So speaking of digital sovereignty, what are your thoughts, and what's the sentiment coming out of Russia around the fake news phenomena that has essentially determined the elections of the U.S.?
Firstly, we don't think that Russian fake news determined as a result of the U.S. election. We believe that Trump was elected because of essential reasons, and Americans wanted to believe him. But of course, this machine which produced fake news, trolls, and so on, to some extent effective, and especially in terms of disrupting discussion on the internet and to dissemination of cynicism among the internet users. What the Kremlin, what is the modus operandi of the Kremlin in this area? The armies of trolls spreading negative information about everything, about parties, about representatives of different groups of population, about political leaders, and it posed you, it put you in a very vulnerable position. You can't, you feel that you can't believe anybody, and so it doesn't matter who will be your new president, or maybe the old strong leader is better than any new leader. That's what they are doing. But I think that we can oppose. I mean that democracy can oppose to these things, developing good mass media, good quality and progressive mass media. That is the way how it could be, how we can combat these things, propaganda.
And maybe the thing is, which we need to understand, that it's all started in our country. And firstly, the first target was the Russian political opposition and independent journalism. And unfortunately, it was first very successful in Russia, mostly because we're still a very confused society, a post-Soviet, post-totalitarian society, with a lack of trust in anything, especially in political institutions. And it left you, when you think of it, it left you with the idea that you have the general public, the population, and the leader, and that's all, nothing in between. And that was used by the Kremlin to the full, because in this case, well, you think, well, at least this guy, he's strong enough. Well, we know who he is, and we do not know all other guys. So it's better to keep with this guy. And it looks like Putin just tried to export this idea of complete distrust in institutions to the United States. I do not believe that it was it was invented by Putin here. I mean, you already had some basis for this kind of mistrust in the establishment, in the media. So what they tried to do, they tried to exploit this feeling. They added some fuel. And unfortunately, it was, well, successful to some degree. As a journalist, I'm a bit skeptical that it completely changes the game. But of course, we added some fuel.
So if I'm hearing you right, just to summarize, it was as much about changing the level of overall trust in our society over a long period of time as it was about any particular election.
Yes.
Yeah.
I have a question kind of along the same lines. So I was at the Oxford Internet Institute back in 2010, kind of studying the beginnings of computational propaganda. And today I have friends who are journalists at NBC, big news outlets who are being tasked with covering these types of things. And I get questions from them like, is this actually real? And so considering that, and this is their job, and so considering that you've seen this in Russia many times in terms of like disinformation campaigns, are there any trends that you've seen evolve in Russia that you think could make the leap to the US?
Well, to be honest, it looks like it started in the West in 2014 mostly, because of the annexation of Crimea. And firstly, the first target was Ukraine, and it was easier because we share the same language, the same prejudices, the same theories about how we feel about the West and our history. So you can play the same tricks for the Russians and for Ukrainians. And then we tried something in Eastern Europe. To some extent, it was really successful. Once again, because lots of people in Eastern Europe feel a bit, I would say, fooled by the West. They were promised it a lot, and it was never delivered. And finally, we tried in the United Kingdom, and we tried with The Guardian, and they immediately got spotted. So it was not a big success, mostly for some language problems. And of course, it was mostly because people who back then were hired to do these kind of things were Russians, based in St. Petersburg and some other places. But unfortunately, it's evolved with time, and now it looks like they got some people based in these countries who are at least partly natives, so they know how to speak and how to address the issues which are really important for this particular region or this particular district, and they use this kind of thing. Still, I do not believe that it's that effective. But what makes them particularly crucial in the Kremlin's propaganda thing, that we have this strange distinction that we have the Russian bureaucracy, which is by definition is extremely slow. And it's not only about foreign ministry, it's also about Russian television, it's also about secret services to some degree, but also we got informal actors. We have people who officially have nothing to do with the government. And on the one hand, it gives the Kremlin a sense that they always could deny responsibility and what we do all the time. But also it makes these groups much more flexible and adventurous because they, unlike the bureaucracy, they have a direct access to the Kremlin, and they can always ask, look, is it fine we do that, or maybe next day we can try this. So it's actually, we are dealing with a very flexible and adventurous community of people who are really well committed to do these things, because actually the risks are still very low for them.
So I guess the answer is it's gotten harder to tell.
Yeah.
Anything you would add, Irina?
Yep.
Anything you want to add to that? Okay, please.
It's somewhat ironic that I think today is Putin's 65th birthday, and as the Economist published this morning, he has no intention of stepping down, as I think you pointed out. And of course, this article, which just this morning was, of course, talking about Navalny. And so I guess two parts of the question from your perspective is, what is his future, Navalny's, given how much an uproar he's made, particularly in the West? You know, he's on 60 Minutes a handful of times. So where is he going, or is he not? And then where, because a lot of, I think, what he's done has been to catalyze somewhat of the youth and millennials and younger people. So what role will younger people play in the next 5 years?
And actually, it might even be worth just giving a bit of quick context for the group on who he is and the work he's done.
Navalny is an opposition politician who adopted the new way of doing politics in Russia. You know that today in Russia, opposition politicians have now access to the media, traditional mass media, TV channels, radio stations, and newspapers, and they could use website, because most of them are under the Kremlin's control or under the control of pro-Kremlin oligarchs. So he started to gain popularity doing things on the net. He set up a special channel on YouTube, then another channel on YouTube. He started, in fact, he started with Twitter and YouTube channel and his own websites. And he 2 years ago he got a lot of popularity that was even bigger. It became bigger in 2017 for I don't know what reasons. Maybe because of financial crisis in Russia and bad economic situation. Maybe because the authoritative regime became stronger than it used to be. But his video usually get millions of views, in fact, tens of millions of views, and
tens of millions of views on a single YouTube video.
Yeah,
yes.
So that's a great thing. And when we have the last mass protest in Moscow, Navalny was arrested, but any case, we got there were tens of thousands of people on the streets, and many of them were students and even schoolboys and schoolgirls. That was really unusual for Russia, because previously we've seen only people who's older than 20.
And maybe answering the question, the interesting thing now is that previously Navalny based all his activity online. It was always about something online. And right now he started building his network offline, and surprisingly it's quite successful. When we got the latest protest, Navalny tried to organize and to enlist people in the regions, and we got protests in 80 towns, which is really
80?
80. So it's really big, because the usual theory and traditional theory about the Russian political opposition is like, well, yes, you have some people voting for you in big towns, but the rest of Russia doesn't care, and they support Putin. It's not the case now. It's a big new development, and I think he would invest more and more resources and more of his time and of his people time into trying to build this network in regions. And it's, as I said, it's quite effective. It's really interesting what might happen to him and to his ideas when he actually started this shift from the online online world to the offline world. Of course, there are some problems because it means it's a very traditional way of building a political party, which means that you need to be ready to answer some traditional questions like, what do you think about the economic situation, political situation, I don't know, Crimea, many things. And he is not that ready. But still, there is some potential.
At the moment, he's in the detention center, was detained 2 days ago for 20 days.
Thank you. Sure.
In the beginning of your talk, you mentioned that there are very few things that could resonate with the general public when it comes to censorship. Do you feel like there is a cultural shift happening in Russian society where people starting to respect freedom of speech more, or is it still mostly about just accessing the BitTorrents and pornography? This is one thing, and another thing. The topic of our talk today is surveillance, censorship, and beyond. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about the beyond part. Do you feel like part of the strategy of the government when it comes to censorship is to make the community complacent with it, and doing it through the idea of censorship being necessary to control the country, to fight terrorism, and to make sure that Russia grows in a stable fashion?
I would try to. It's actually the interesting thing that there is a way to answer both of your questions. And one, it looks like 5 years ago when we introduced this system, they tried to play some tricks, like we are protecting children, we are doing things. We're just doing exactly the same thing that was first introduced by the British. So in a way, we imitate the British approach to internet filtering. And it looks like some years ago, actually 2 years ago, they completely abandoned all pretenses. Now it's even not about terrorists. It's about the West. We have the West. They are plotting against us. We need to fight back. We need to protect us. And unfortunately, this idea is accepted by many. And even the ideas of complete reshuffle of the infrastructure in the country is sort of accepted by many because the internet is seen as an invention of the Americans, so we need to fight back. They installed, for example, there was a crazy story just 2 years ago, how the idea of data localization was sold to Russia. Some Russian officials said from the stage that actually you can see in Crimea some of the people playing Warcraft. They were, now they are not capable of playing because they are cut off by the Americans. So we need to do something about it. Even this kind of pretext, well, unfortunately, are quite popular, and people accept this idea.
And second question. Of course, I think that it always started with something non-political, like torrents websites and pornography, and this has shifted very soon to politics, because to block pornography websites is also politics. It's restriction.
Thank you all again. Thank you.
Thank you.
And
Thank you very much.